everyone, and thanks for joining the call today. Obviously, we're trying to let some people in, and I'm sure some more people will be logging in, and we'll let those guys in as soon as possible as well. Just to introduce Sacha, so we're really lucky that she's joined us. She's joined us from a law firm called Burke, Anglian based, but works internationally as well. Sacha is a UK immigration lawyer that I've known for a while, and she trained back in the day with PwC Legal. She's really, really skilled. She's really technically strong, and she's worked and works with a range of clients from corporate clients to private individuals. She joined Burkett's back in 2021, and she's currently a partner with them. And while she makes like a great AI doll, she's obviously a fantastic lawyer as well. So we're really privileged to have her on the call today. Burkett's have a great client base across London, East Anglia, but they also happen to work with a lot of construction companies and developers. So she's obviously maybe more au fait with the sector than some lawyers. Now, obviously, immigration is like a really fascinating, or I think it is anyway, fascinating topic. I mean, everyone certainly has an opinion on it, and it's kind of always in the news, and today is obviously no exception. I guess in reality, immigration is always like a bit of a balloon. So if you make changes to the law in one part, you squeeze a balloon and it shapes and deforms and then reforms. So, all these changes just push down and impact somewhere else. Now, obviously, immigration has gone on from the dawn of time, and it will continue to go on. Like in the UK, we've seen like the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Romans, and many waves of immigration over the years. And of course, like after like World War II, we openly encouraged people, invited people to the UK to help rebuild the country. So nurses, bus drivers, and of course, construction labourers were all needed to rebuild our homes, which had turned to rubble. So, of course, we're not the only ones to be affected by migration. You've got Australia being an outpost for prisoners back in the day, and Europe obviously being impacted by the, years of migration as well. And obviously you've got the US, like inward migration from like the Irish famine, the slave trade, and of course it was like the Dutch that founded New York. So when you start tracking immigration, it's a bit like a human geography and history lesson wrapped in with some geopolitics. And I guess what we're seeing now is certainly more borders and walls coming up, and obviously this is impacting the UK and across the globe. I think you only have to look at some of the riots and the situation that's happening in LA to see how this is like a real personal topic. Like these are real families, real lives, and real companies. And so when migration goes wrong, it can have real impact on people. So obviously we're not here to talk about sort of politics. We just want to be sort of apolitical as possible to some extent. But I just obviously wanted to sort of set the scene and introduce Sacha. She's obviously got some interesting things to tell us all today, and then obviously hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end. So is there anything you want to ask, just drop it on the chat and we'll try and pick it up then, if that's okay.
Lovely. Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I think that just really sets the scene perfectly for where we're at. I will endeavour to be as apolitical as possible, but as you know, I don't have an affinity to any party whatsoever, but immigration is very much a political hot potato, and it really drives a lot of change in terms of businesses' ability to recruit and to get the right talent, and especially for the real estate and construction sector. So there's a bit of change, which obviously I'm going to talk about today. So as Mary said, I'm going to canter through. I've put way more content than I'm going to have time to cover. I'm very happy for Mary to share the slides with everybody afterwards, so that's not a problem at all. And if you've got questions, I'd pop them in the chat, and I'll try and review as we go along at little intervals. So I'll go from there. Moving on. The slide's stuck. There we go. So yeah, as Mary already said about me, so I'm at Burkett's, and I've been doing immigration for the best part of 15 years now, in sort of all sectors and all different business sizes, but really, I say, focusing on anyone coming into the UK, and so all business sizes. So it's hopefully I've seen it all before. Hopefully I'll be able to answer any of your questions. If there's anything that comes in the chat I can't answer, I'll go away and find out, and I'll come back to you as well. But what I really wanted to kind of start out with is kind of the importance of the sector of, kind of getting the foundations right. So there was a recent report that was published at the end of 2024, September 24, which really highlighted that the sort of construction sector in particular, there were some real challenges with immigration and international workers and getting that right. And 41% of those surveyed from the construction sector had a belief that illegal working was really common in the sector. And that was the highest percentage across all the different sectors that were polled. So that definitely has put the Home Office on quite significant alert that there are probably some problems that they need to root out. And just in terms of when they were asked, what sort of checks do you do on your international talent to prove their right to work, then we found that 70% of those surveyed were incorrect in what they thought they could accept in terms of proof of right to work. So obviously it's great to have access to that international talent, but only if it's done so legally. And that can be, I say, problematic and difficult. And the rules change a lot, and it's hard to get your head around. But one of the factors that make construction sector in particular really challenging is obviously the extensive use. And in many ways, you're really kind of leading the field to other industries around the benefits of using apprentices and those vocational skill sets. But that say comes with some matching risk to go with it. So apprentices, 0-hour agency and contract workers cause a real compliance headache in terms of your international talent, and you can get quite quickly into deep water without necessarily appreciating it was your liability. So kind of key message being obviously that right to work checks on all your staff are absolutely essential. And just because you use contractors and your argument might be, well, they're not my employee, so I can't get penalised if they don't have the right to work. The Home Office are, as you might imagine, starting to take a much broader view of that. And they'll try and look to establish if you had knowledge. Is it really that they're, what is their employment status? Are they genuinely contractors, or are they really your employees and, you're just calling it something else? And also where you work with agencies, you can't delegate your outgoing sort of compliance obligations. So making sure that you get that right and are aware of the restrictions on what you can outsource and what you can't. So just kind of on the back of that, there was then, and obviously immigration is a very big sort of hot political subject at the moment, and the new government, having come in July, are now trying to show very quickly that they're taking immigration very seriously. It's obviously a key issue for the electorate. And as we saw in the local council results last week, the surge of popularity of parties such as Reform is believed to largely be led by people's concerns around migration, and whether or not there are jobs for British workers, and all those sorts of key issues. So since the Labour government came into power, they've really upped their enforcement and compliance. So we've seen a 51% uptick in arrests of people that they are found to not have a right to be in the UK, 9,000 compliance visits in just 11 months to business sites to identify any issues with the workforce. And for those employers that have got sponsor licenses to enable them to sponsor visas for international workers, we've seen a lot of those start to get their licenses removed. So these numbers are overall numbers, so they're not sector specific to construction. But you can well imagine that of the sort of 1,500 or so organisations that have had their licenses revoked, you can be certain there are construction and real estate based businesses that are impacted by that. And this was a comment, a press release from Dame Angela Eagle, who's the Minister for Illegal Migration and Prevention of Illegal Migration in the UK, that they are specifically targeting construction sites as an area of focus to identify illegal working in the UK, with a view to making arrests and deporting individuals without right to be here. So the particular focus, obviously, is any employer that's facilitating illegal working, and then also there's a lot of focus on the working conditions for migrants in particular, but workforce in general, making sure that they're not working illegal hours and that minimum wage is applying. So, I'm talking from an immigration angle, but there's lots of employment law risks as well, which the sector's battling with. And on the back of that, just a couple of examples of these kind of raids that have been taking place. So in March this year, 36 were arrested on a construction site in Belfast. Another incident in Bradford where there was kind of those sort of known sites where people go and hang around and wait to get picked up to go and do some work on a construction site in the mornings. So 9 workers were picked up on a specific location there. So that kind of targeted using sort of inside information to find out where those people might be, and then specifically identifying them and taking efforts to target them, to remove them, is the name of the game with the Home Office at the moment. So they're really taking this seriously. And certainly I've had clients come to me. So they haven't been pre-existing clients, but the Home Office have turned up unannounced and unexpected, which has caused all sorts of chaos, as you can imagine, for the day's operation, and then ultimately led to some of the workforce then going missing or being detained. So it can really be problematic, and that's why the key message is let's get ahead of this, and you don't want to get caught up either reputationally or otherwise with any of these incidents. So just kind of following the kind of preordained structure for the session today. So hopefully I'm going to be covering everything you were expecting when you signed up to listen to the talk today. But just a kind of an overview of how do you actually go about hiring compliantly. So what I wanted to start with was just kind of winding it back a bit. So the current kind of environment that we're operating in. So the government's come in, they were elected and appointed last summer. They've kind of got 4 key aspects of kind of international recruitment and international people coming into the UK. The mindset is one, first of all, the government is looking to reduce migration overall into the UK. They're pushing the prevention of illegal working by imposing much stricter right to work checks across the board, eliminating abuse, in particular of migrant workers and those that are vulnerable, by looking at restrictions on where people are kind of forcing costs, so recruitment costs onto people illegally. But then also trying to reduce reliance in the sector on overseas talent by looking at how businesses can commit to improving skills and technological innovations that would reduce overall reliance on overseas workers and hopefully create opportunities for the existing resident workforce in the UK. So that's kind of the 4 core aims of the government. And we hear a lot in the press around what's going on and how that's affecting people's ability to hire international talent. But I think my key message is, the UK is very much still open for business. There is no cap on the number of visas that the UK can issue. So there's no limitation on how many people can come in and what workers can get here, as long as you meet the visa criteria. Visa cost, though, is absolutely a deterrent, and I'll show you a worked example shortly, which will just exemplify just how expensive the UK immigration system is. But also, there isn't actually any obligation on businesses to prioritise British workers. So there's no what we call a resident labour market test. So in other countries, I think Switzerland still got one, the UK used to have it, that you couldn't recruit international workers until you'd really tested that there weren't any suitable British candidates. That isn't the case anymore. So actually, you're still able to pick the best person for the job. But if you choose to prioritise a British worker over the migrant worker, then actually that also creates a risk of discrimination, which can be problematic. But ultimately, visa restrictions are high, and it's increasingly difficult to get a visa and to qualify for it. So that in and of itself is just limiting who exactly you can employ into what roles. But what I wanted to really highlight is, when you're looking to fill roles and vacancies, we don't have to jump to visa sponsorship straight away. So what I've done is just highlight on the screen that there are certain visas that are limited because they are sponsor-led. So typically a skilled worker visa, or if you've been around in international recruitment for a while, that used to be called the Tier 2 general route. That's kind of a common visa that people have to come and work in the UK. But there are lots of other visas available. So you can have an international applicant and they might not necessarily need visa sponsorship. So you can have visa permission under global talent, graduate visa, high potential youth visa, spouse and partner visas, or somebody that's been in the UK for a long time and has got permanent residence already. So that's what we call indefinite leave to remain. Or if they're EU nationals, pre-settled or settled status that they got under the Brexit transition arrangements. So we don't always need to jump to visa sponsorship, and there'd be no problem at all. Anyone with a visa that's listed on the right-hand side of that table, you can onboard immediately with a normal right to work check, and they're there without work restrictions or otherwise. So we don't necessarily need to jump to visa costs, as I say, straight away. And then just looking across broadly in the sector, so the UK immigration system as it is today, and it is likely to change by the end of the month, so I am going to put a bit of a caveat on the content of this presentation, but as of today, on the screen is just a smattering of examples of different roles within the sector that you would be able to qualify for sponsorship for. Obviously, this isn't the only roles that you have in your industry. As you might imagine, any sort of architects, designers, etc., they can also come under the sponsorship system. But I just wanted to show an example that there's management-based roles and directors in the industry that can qualify for sponsorship, all the way through to the sort of trade roles that you need to physically ensure the construction of any building. So there's a real wide variety there that enables you currently to sponsor visas. And not only that, but that the UK recognise that there is already a shortage of these roles in the of people with these skills in the UK. So actually, there's some preferential treatment still available for recruitment of quite a lot of these positions at the moment. Now, I've obviously said you don't have to jump to visa sponsorship straight away, but undoubtedly, where you've got an international candidate, you'll probably still find probably seven times out of 10 that they might well need visa sponsorship. Either if they're already in the UK and they work for someone else and they want to transition over to your employment, or if you're hiring them from the first time and you've identified them as candidates from overseas and then you're going to bring them into the UK. And the way that you would do that is your UK business would become a registered sponsor with the Home Office. And once your business is an approved sponsor and you've got a license, you can then go ahead and sponsor individual workers to come into your organisation to do a very specific role for you. And they can then work for you for a limited period, usually sort of 3 to 5 years, until such time as they're going to qualify for their own independent permanent resident status. Now, the nice thing about UK immigration is that pretty much if you tick the box and you meet the criteria, you'll get the visa. So we're fortunate that there's not kind of lots of interviews of candidates to decide whether or not your face fits and that you're kind of likable in that respect. So it's quite reliable and a dependable visa system. The other thing to say is it's mostly digital now, which is very beneficial in terms of it being quite a quick and easy process. And I say the main kind of barrier that I think most people will find with the system is cost more than anything. But just in an overview, in terms of being eligible to get a visa to come and work in the UK in this sector, first of all, it has to be an eligible role. So as per the previous slide, almost all roles in the sector are going to be eligible roles at the moment. There are minimum salary requirements to be eligible for visa sponsorship, and they are increasingly high. So I'll show you on the next slide or so the salary criteria that have to be met. The applicants also have to speak English to a proficient level. I think perhaps one thing that I see more typically of this sector, I see similar in some other sectors such as care and hospitality as well, is very often we've got really fantastic workers and they speak great English and they can understand it and have a great conversation with you, but their written English might be a bit more of a challenge for them, and that can be problematic because you've got to meet the English criteria in all 4 facets, so reading, writing, speaking and listening. So sometimes that can be a little bit of a barrier for the sector. And a few other sort of lower level criteria, but largely say as long as you've got a sponsorship certificate from your employer and the role meets the criteria and you're paid the correct salary, the process is quite straightforward. So it's an online form. You attend a biometric appointment, so you enroll you do a fingerprint scan, they take a photograph of you using a liveness screening, so sort of video of your face, very similar to sort of online banking. And in fact, for a lot of countries, they can use an app now to register rather than going through a visa appointment. And I say visa processing, pretty reliable. You'll get a visa typically within sort of anything between a couple of days and a few weeks. And as you might expect with the Home Office, they've learned that the more urgent the need is to fill the vacancy, the more you'll pay. So you can pay for various upgrades to get your visa processed more quickly. Now, the employer will sponsor for sort of typically 3 or 5 year increments. That just aligns to the cost of visa applications and how the Home Office operates. And then once you are sponsored, generally speaking, you can only work for your employing company, the one that will provide you with sponsorship. So you can't go off and freelance for other people generally, up to a limit of you can do a little bit of a secondary employment of 20 hours a week, which really just tends to allow people to top up their sort of Monday to Friday jobs with a couple of weekend shifts here and there if they needed to. But there's not any expectation that you can generally go and work for other businesses. So at least if you are sponsoring as an employer, you've got that reassurance that that worker is very much sort of initially at least tied to you, and committed to you, because the visa only allows you to work for your specific employer. So that's kind of the overview of the skilled worker visa. I mean, I'm happy to go into any more specific details on it. But you say, generally speaking, it's pretty accessible as a category, and fairly reliable in terms of getting people into the country. And people say they tend to have that sponsorship for 5 years, and then at the moment after 5 years, you would go on to get permanent status, and at that point, you're no longer tied to your specific sponsor. There is, and I'll talk a little bit later, some suggestion that that might be increased shortly to a longer period. So the key criteria, then, one of the key criteria for being able to come and work in this sector as an international hire is that your role has to meet the minimum salary requirements, and that's quite high. So for a lot of people, the minimum salary requirement is 38,700 per annum, which can be quite punchy, but actually for a lot of the more trades-based roles, they are on what we call the immigration salary list, which is almost kind of a recognised list of roles where we know in the UK we don't have enough of those sorts of skills. And if it's a job that's in one of those on that list, then you've got a lower salary criteria of 30,960 per annum. So just in the boxes on the right-hand side, you'll see those on the purple are on that immigration salary list. So their minimum salary is 30,960, or the rate in the box on the right if it's higher. The roles in the top, you'll see, so civil engineers, it's probably not unsurprising that their minimum salary criteria is much higher. And that's just really based on industry averages. So the Home Office really always require that migrant workers are being paid at least above the average for that job. So they're not kind of causing wage deflation by bringing international workers in. So there can be a big variation, as I say. Some roles 30,960 per annum, other roles over £50,000, and that should be commensurate to what's expected of an industry average. But it's whichever the high of those two criteria will apply. Now, the one thing I've probably seen the most in the construction sector in particular is you may well have a company that's got an approved license, you've issued a certificate of sponsorship, and the candidate, has got their English test, the job pays enough money, and you think, great, I'm going to easily tick all the boxes and get that visa granted. One of the areas where we do see, and it's more unique to the construction sector than others, is that the Home Office will be more inclined often to ask a few more questions around the sponsorship. And they often want to check that this really is a genuine role, and that the person really is truly qualified and has the work experience to come and do that position. So I have often seen people in the construction sector getting asked further questions from the Home Office around what's your recruitment process, how do you vet applicants' skill levels, do you check their references, do you require them to have qualifications? If they have to have qualifications but they're done overseas, how do you verify that? And do you use probation periods? So I think one of the areas where I've seen businesses in the sector struggle the most is that the Home Office will ask some of these questions, and very often the workers, especially more in the trade-based roles, it'll be referrals from existing employees saying, oh, I worked with this person on site before, maybe overseas, and they were very good. And you kind of take the recommendation on kind of almost like a gentleman's agreement, that's a solid recommendation, and often there's not much more of a vetting process than that, and the Home Office aren't particularly comfortable with that. So I think that's where one area specific to this sector that I've seen kind of fall down the most. Now it's difficult because if you've got a bricklayer, you're not going to ask them to do a Zoom interview and get them to show you on video that they can construct a wall to an adequate standard, or you're most unlikely to run your recruitment in that vein. So I think that's where the Home Office struggle to get comfortable sometimes, that obviously recruitment for different roles, it's going to be different between professional services and more vocational and trades-based routes. So that can be a challenge, but something to think about, just to make sure you've got robust answers and evidence if you're ever audited. Now, if you are going on to sponsor somebody, it then comes with a load of kind of ongoing reporting obligations to the Home Office, because effectively you as the employer becomes the gatekeeper to for the Home Office to ensure compliance. So if that worker then leaves your employment for whatever reason, so either you dismiss them or that they choose to move on to a different role with a different sponsor, you'd then be obligated to notify the Home Office that they were no longer in your employment. So you're helping the Home Office keep their records up to date. And then if they want to identify that someone's overstayed after their job has finished, those notifications help the Home Office with that compliance. And there are various other things that as an employer, if you've got sponsored workers, that you have to notify throughout the life cycle of their employment with you. So not only do you do right to work checks when they start and notify the Home Office when they finish in the employment with you, there are different aspects of their employment that you would notify to the Home Office throughout the life cycle. So if they get a change in job title, they've got promoted, pay increases, if they move to a different part of the country for a different site location for you, etc., then all those sorts of things are reportable to the Home Office, and it's incumbent upon you as the sponsor to help the Home Office stay on top of some of these aspects of sponsorship. Now, one thing I see probably in real estate in particular is obviously lots of sort of real estate investment vehicles will go through a lot of M&A activity. And if you're a sponsor and if you've got highly skilled workers in your organisation, which can be anything, it might be a financial analyst or otherwise, that are sponsored and on work visas, if your organisation goes through any sort of M&A activity, any sort of restructuring, you receive any sort of equity investment into the business, or you make any disposals, then all those elements are also reportable to the Home Office. So the Home Office really want to know what are your employees doing and what's going on with them, but also what's going on with the company. And that's part of the government's general mandate to try and share more information. So the Home Office is sharing information with HMRC and other kind of industry regulating bodies to make sure that businesses are compliant from all angles. So just to make yourself aware that by being a sponsor, there's multiple aspects of compliance to consider. And so just the kind of the practical tips there is to make sure, A, that you're really refreshed on what your reporting obligations are, but that you've also then got kind of process flows in place that you might be checking in annually with your staff to check if your data's up to date, or look at your kind of performance management cycles to say, right, well, we do promotions at this time of year. This is when we'd report promotions or, changes in position. So those sorts of things. And then also, actually your line managers, because they're really on the front line with staff. So it's all, it's great that HR are mostly on top of this, but actually line managers are going to really help you keep on top of all your sponsor duties and obligations as well. So that's just something to flag separately. Now, I obviously talked about, the Home Office taking lots of effort to look at compliance and enforcement. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of risks that you'd maybe want to consider when you're hiring international talent, and things and factors to consider. So the first of all is, as I said, starting from a really good foundation is who's got the right to work in the UK and in your organisation. So I've just included on the slide there just a summary. So whatever your demographic of employee is, how do you do the right to work checks for them? And where they're international employees, so if they're not British or Irish, mostly you're going to be doing checks using one of the Home Office's online systems. So it's all digital now, which is really helpful and very accessible. And it means that you're not, as an employer, trying to work out, does that visa document look like it gives them right to work in the UK? The Home Office make it very easy, and they just say yes or no using the online system. So that's really helpful. Obviously, lots of people, and actually in this sector in particular, probably still the majority of your workforce are British and Irish nationals. So you can still do a manual check of their physical British passport to check their right to work. So that's an ongoing thing, and that hasn't changed. But one thing I did want to highlight on the right to work checks is, in my experience, and especially in this sector, where businesses actually are quite good at doing the right to work check, they'll take a copy of the document, but actually the write-up and the stuff that's kept on file isn't adequate to give them all the kind of coverage that you need as an employer to have a protection from liability. So what I've highlighted on the screen is the step 2 of the check process. And it's just to highlight that, yes, you need to get a result from the Home Office which says this international person can work in my organisation. But a key part to the rest of the check is you have to have met that person, at least via video link, if they're kind of a remote off-site worker, or if you meet them in person. You have to verify that the person that's turning up to work for you every day is the same as the person on the Home Office paperwork. So you have to match the photo with the identity of the worker. So, and you have to document that you've done that. And I think that's the biggest thing that I see in this sector in particular, is there's often photocopies of passports left, right, and centre on people's HR files. At no point does it say that it's been used for a right to work check. At no point does it say, yes, that looks like the person that turns up to work every day. So just that level of detail is required. There's no point doing a check and not doing it properly, because otherwise you've got no statutory protection then. So it's just really to highlight there are some very specific requirements of the checks, and it really is worth reading that guidance in detail to make sure you're doing it all correctly. So I just shared on the screen, if you're going to do a digital check, this is what it looks like. So that's the result you'd get on the website, and then you can just save that as a PDF, sort of print to PDF on your desktop and save that result. And then you can do that part 2 imposter check, and make sure that's all saved on file to make sure you've got a full check. But it is nice and easy now, you can do it online. Now, assuming we've there said, right, we're going to bring that person on board and they're going to have the right to work, or I need to get them sponsorship to give them the right to work. The other kind of big cost, therefore, the other big risk, therefore, sorry, is cost. So as I mentioned at the start, visas are really expensive. And I've just put a worked example on the screen here. So a single worker that you are going to sponsor, the total visa cost for them can be in excess of £8,000. If they're a family of 4, in excess of £20,000, and that's just on Home Office fees. So there's no legal advice in that, there's no relocation support in that, so it's pretty hefty, and that's just for 3 years. So that's not going to get them to permanent residence either. So it's kind of big money. But what I would say is, as I say, cost is obviously important. We know as a sector, money's tight, or it can be. So how do you manage that risk of the significant cost of hiring an international worker? And what we do see is businesses will often put in place either loans for, at least put in place what we call a clawback arrangement. So an add-on to their employment contract saying, look, we're happy to employ you and we're happy to sponsor you, but if you choose to quit and go and work for someone else, we're going to try and recoup some of that cost. So managing your cost of hiring is a really important kind of risk mitigation aspect to consider to your strategy. Now, some of the elements of the visa fees you aren't allowed to recoup from an individual, and that's just been reviewed recently by the government with current changes. But certainly some of the elements absolutely are. And you might make a decision as a business that either you cover all the costs. In my experience in real estate and construction sectors, that's much more rare. Usually, I find that businesses will pay some of the visa application costs, and the employees will pay some themselves, and that way everybody's bought into the process. So, but managing visa costs is it can be a really big challenge. The more people you hire, obviously, the bigger undertaking it is. It can really impact cash flow. So bear that in mind. But a couple of things to note is that you can't pass on the cost of recruitment. So any kind of recruitment agents you work with, you cannot pass on their fees to the individuals. And also, if you are using legal advice to help them get visas, etc., then generally speaking, legal fees are no longer recoverable unless the employee was really given the option as to whether or not they wanted to use that lawyer to help them, or did you give them an option that they could go and find their own lawyer. So that's kind of a shifting picture, as I say, with the new government that are really focusing on employees and their welfare and making sure they're not abused by employers that have got stronger kind of control and influence. There's kind of recognition of the power imbalance between employers and employees sometimes. So there's greater protections that are being introduced on that. Then another thing to consider just in terms of managing risk is employment claims. So as I mentioned at the start of the call, there's actually no obligation to prioritise British workers. And you can therefore headhunt and pick exactly whichever international worker you so choose. But then obviously when you're going through a vetting process, picking through candidates, there's always a risk that whichever people you reject from the process, you don't want them to bring a claim that they've been rejected or hired on the basis of their nationality. So it's really important just to say that when you're going through recruitment, you need to be open-minded. You're not allowed in the UK to restrict applications only to UK nationals. And you can't reject applicants solely because they might require visa sponsorship, or very rarely can you do that. So that's really important. I think we're seeing an increasing number of employment claims around those sorts of issues. Are you letting me go because you don't want to keep paying for my visa costs, etc. So this is a much greater risk area for businesses than perhaps we've seen historically. And certainly in my experience, for me now to be referring to my employment law colleagues is a much more common occurrence than it ever has been in sort of the last 15 years of my career. So it's definitely a shifting pattern. So I've just put on the slide there just a few examples of wording that you can put in your job adverts and things to think about. So I say being neutral, that you're not focusing on nationality, or elements that would be limited to only sort of native Brits, for example. So you can't say necessarily that you've got to be a native British speaker, English speaker, unless there's a genuine reason for that requirement. Because obviously being fluent largely is going to be sufficient if they're a different nationality. So just being really mindful about what goes into the job advert can be really important. Now, it's one question I'm increasingly receiving is obviously with those higher salary thresholds, there'll be a number of positions and vacancies where you'll say, well, look, I'm happy to have international candidates apply, but if they need sponsorship, they won't qualify because we don't pay enough to meet the Home Office's sponsorship requirements. And that's absolutely fine. And clients will often ask me saying, well, do I have to increase the pay to make sure that they meet the eligibility criteria? And the answer to that is absolutely not. So what you don't want to do is create a risk of an employment claim for fair pay, where different people, because different people doing the same job are getting in receipt of different pay purely based on their nationality or visa requirements. So it's just being mindful of that and being very clear. You might say, look, we're happy to consider your application, but you just won't be eligible for sponsorship. And if that prevents you taking the role because you have no other visa permission, then that's kind of so be it. So I am seeing more employers kind of engaging with this and thinking about, not directly stopping people applying for a vacancy depending on nationality and visa requirement, but just bearing in mind and being a little bit more transparent, because what you don't want is everybody investing in a recruitment process, which can obviously take weeks, sometimes months to get through, and the candidate and the hiring manager are all invested in wanting to go forward, and you get to the end only to say, oh no, we can't get a visa. So it can be useful to provide that information up front, but just to say, in terms of managing risk, you want to be very careful about how you do that so you don't accidentally fall into the parameters of being open to an employment claim. And obviously, as I've said around mitigating cost, it's absolutely fine for you to recoup costs from individuals in some aspects for their visa support. But there is also employment law considerations around the enforceability of any clawback arrangements. For example, would the employment tribunal consider that to be a punitive clause in their contracts, etc., or is it a risk of discrimination for that candidate? So again, it can be worth taking advice on that before you start enforcing or writing up agreements that may prove not later to be enforceable. So I don't think I've seen any questions come in the chat yet, so don't be shy. I'm very happy to pause and take them as they come along. But obviously, I think we're going to have a little bit of time at the end, which I can open it up. But in the absence of any questions at this point, I'll carry on. So sort of key regulations and things to be aware of. So as I say, from an immigration perspective, now I've said that as an employer, you become the gatekeeper for the Home Office. And then what happens is that the Home Office will come in and do an audit on an ad hoc basis to make sure that you're complying with all your sponsor duties and meeting all their requirements. Now, the Home Office can audit any business whatsoever. It doesn't necessarily have to have international employees to be subject to an audit. Obviously, more often than not, in terms of prioritising their efforts, they will be picking international workforces. But Home Office audits can be done by an unannounced in-person visit. So they just turn up on site one day and request to see the relevant site manager or otherwise, or HR team leader if they're in a head office, and want to make an inspection there and then. That's less common, but certainly the construction sector probably suffers those, one of the most impacted sectors by unannounced visits. Pre-arranged visits are usually more kind of standard, and the reason for that being there's no point in the Home Office turning up and then whoever's in charge of visa sponsorships on holiday, because that's a waste of everybody's time. So usually they will try and pre-arrange a visit. They won't give you a lot of notice. It's a little bit like when Ofsted go into schools, they probably get about 3 or 4 days notice of an audit taking place, but not much more than that. But also a lot of the audits now, rather than being in person, are being undertaken virtually. So the Home Office will invite employers to do an interview via a Zoom or a Teams call. It helps them because then it can be recorded. And it's also just much more accessible people. So, if the Home Office are based in certain hubs around the country, by doing virtual checks, it really helps them check businesses at all ends of the UK, no matter how remote the site is. So that can be really helpful for them. And a lot of it will be done by desktop survey. So they'll say, show me your recruitment process, send me evidence. So have you got interview notes? Have you got copies of your job adverts? Have you got copies of the qualifications for your employees and any onboarding checks that you do, etc.? So that's kind of increasingly common, and it just helps them check more businesses more frequently, quite frankly. So as I say, Home Office audits can be triggered by many things. Sometimes it's just a timing thing, and they say, well, we've not been to check your business for a long time. Sometimes they'll get a tip off. So if you've got we see sometimes aggrieved employees might then call the Home Office hotline and say, oh, I think they've got an illegal worker on site, or aggrieved family members. Sadly, if you've kind of got separating couples, I've definitely seen instances where they call the Home Office and say, oh, my ex hasn't got right to work in the UK or right to be here. So that can be a trigger. Border control inquiries. So when people are coming in and out of the country, sometimes you might be stopped and questioned. I've seen that increasingly at certain airports. Luton and Stansted seem to be having a lot more higher rate of inquiries from border officials. That can then trickle through into a full review of the business that those individuals are saying that they're working at. And then just generally, if you're sponsoring a visa, they might use that as a trigger point to have a conversation with you around your processing. So it can really happen at any point throughout your life cycle. So it's around knowing that and having an action plan. So you might have, certainly in your head offices, you've perhaps got a protocol for what happens if a regulator comes in unannounced. What do reception do? What do the security staff do? Who gets called? It's useful to have that plan in place in case the Home Office turn up unannounced. And as I say, the construction sector probably suffer the most. So anyone that's a site manager or responsible for day-to-day site management, it would be worth making sure that people are run through that and you've got an idea and a plan as to what would happen if the Home Office turn up. I'm afraid to say I've had quite a few construction clients come to me and they've had penalties from the Home Office, and the write-up of the Home Office's experiences. We turned up on site and all of a sudden people were scarpering left, right and centre, jumping over fences, driving off. So it can all be a little bit exciting, but obviously that's not what we want to happen, because even if you're not guilty, it doesn't look good, does it? So being prepared for that audit is really important. So I've just included on the screen what the Home Office come and look at. I say there is an overwhelming focus at the moment for the Home Office just to check basic right to work checks. And that's not just for your international staff. So they'll look at right to work checks that you do for British nationals, anyone on a sponsored visa, and anyone on a visa that's on a non-sponsored category, so a spouse visa, for example. So they'll look at all aspects and all employees. So whatever you do, don't make the mistake of just focusing on your sponsored workers and their files. Make sure everything is up to date. And And then they'll just more generally say, look at all your record keeping and reporting requirements and your retention of data. And the one thing I wanted to highlight there is, obviously with GDPR rules, everyone's very worried about not retaining data for too long. So really, I just wanted to highlight that because the Home Office require you to retain data, sometimes for 2 years after the employment is finished, that's a reasonable legal excuse for retention of data that kind of overrides the GDPR obligation to dispose of data. So I say, don't be kind of too efficient by disposing and cleansing your files and data too quickly if the Home Office require you to hold data for longer. And as I say, the Home Office can review anything. They'll look if you've got a license, they'll have a look at that, make sure that you're reporting if there's been any change in ownership. So as I mentioned, M&A activity, disposals and acquisitions all have to be reported. I'm increasingly seeing companies that are reporting activity via Companies House if there's been a corporate change or acquisition, but then failing to report it separately to the Home Office. And unfortunately, we don't have a good enough service that you report to one part of the government and they update everybody else. So you do have to make separate notifications to the Home Office. And as I say, what I'm seeing is they'll check your license, but they'll also interview and check files for sponsored, non-sponsored, and your British workforce. So everybody's kind of subject to review. Now, I'm kind of conscious of time, so we've got about 15 minutes. So I just wanted to now talk briefly around what we're expecting to change. So the world of immigration lawyers all got very excited because a couple of weeks ago, the government finally published a paper that was saying what they intended to do on visas and mobility, and therefore we could understand what impact that's going to have for organisations that are needing to recruit internationally to fill those skills gaps in the UK and to fill those vacancies. So some of the things that have kind of been changing recently, which are relevant, I've already mentioned some of these. So I've talked about kind of managing the cost and your immigration fees. So there's been some additional guidance around what you can claim from employees that you sponsor and what you cannot. So certificates of sponsorship and the levy, which was called an immigration skills charge for employers, you can't recoup that from the employee. I've obviously mentioned legal fees are now starting to be excluded from the ability to recoup that from staff members. But one thing they are looking at as well is if you make a loan to an employee, so you might say, look, we know that your salary is, you don't have all that money in savings to pay for your visa right now, so we'll loan money to you and we'll then just deduct it from your wages each month or each week. That's still absolutely lawful, but what the Home Office are doing is they're saying, well, look, you've got to meet a minimum salary requirement to be eligible for sponsorship. So if you're given visa support by way of a loan that then comes out of your wages, the Home Office will take into account any loan deduction when assessing if you meet the minimum salary requirement. So again, that is causing some problems for employees that are really kind of close to the threshold as to whether or not they qualify for the visa. So that's something to flag. Generally, visa costs are going up and up. Every 6 months, the costs go up a little bit more. So the cost of the certificate of sponsorship has just gone up by 120%. So it used to be £239. It's now £525 to sponsor a worker for your certificate of sponsorship. So big increase in cost. One thing that I wanted to flag is very important for the real estate and construction sector. As I said, there's a higher prevalence of gig economy workers, 0-hour contractors and agency workers. So the Home Office are due imminently to update their prevention of illegal working guidance, which will mean that you have to do right to work checks on individuals. So even if they say they're self-employed or they're on 0-hour contracts, or sort of freelancing roles, that you're going to have to start to check their right to work as well if they're providing a service to you. So that hasn't come yet, but I did just want to highlight that is probably very imminent in terms of changes. So keep an eye out for that because I think that could have a really big impact on the sector and just cause a bit more admin. And then I say sort of the bigger changes, and I think this is where we might see some big changes impacting the construction sector, is at the moment you can sponsor roles there are what we call RQF level 3. So that would be someone akin to an A level qualification experience. Now that doesn't mean you have to have an A level in that discipline, but you have to have equivalent kind of on the job experience. And that's why at the moment it's possible to sponsor in those trades roles. Now, the Home Office are set to increase skill levels for visa sponsorship back up to degree level, which in theory will likely preclude a lot of those trade roles that are so essential to construction from being eligible for visa sponsorship. Now, that will obviously help cut immigration numbers, but it would cause challenges for the government's target in terms of house building and otherwise. So what we're likely to see is that some of those roles are likely to then move over into what we call a temporary shortage list, and that hasn't come into play yet. I understand it's due to come out at the end of the month. But if that role, so likely I say the sort of more trades roles that are important for construction, they'll move on to what we think is a temporary shortage list. That will mean that you can sponsor workers, but likely only for a much smaller period of time. They're unlikely to give that a pathway to settlement in the UK, so that might make it a little bit more unpalatable to be able to recruit for workers to come to the UK for those positions. And it's also likely that they won't be able to bring their family members into the UK. So again, it might make recruitment into those sorts of vacancies a lot harder going forward as and when those changes come in. But we don't yet have the detail for me to be able to share that with you. So it is still a policy paper. We haven't got draft legislation, but just so you know that that's kind of an issue that we might well see for the construction sector later. If we see a lot of those roles that were on my screen earlier that you can currently sponsor, no longer being able to sponsor in the same way. Visa costs, again, I've obviously highlighted the certificate cost went up. The levy, the skills charge that employers have to pay is also due to go up. That's going up by a whopping sort of 32%. So again, and that's not a cost you can pass on to the employee. So another thing to think about. And then also what's likely, I suppose, probably the next, the two other big things to mention off this policy paper is the Home Office are proposing that they're going to have to sponsor for 10 years in the skilled worker category, no longer the current 5-year period. So that again is going to create a huge cost implication for businesses that have got international workers. And then, as I mentioned, obviously English language can sometimes be a difficulty for some people in this sector, and the Home Office are due to increase the English language requirement as well. So all in all, you can just feel kind of the walls pulling in a bit, making it a little bit tighter about who's going to qualify for visa sponsorship going forward. So some potential big challenges there. But as I say, ultimately, there's not going to be any cap on the visas. Just a sort of a limitation on some of the parameters just to narrow it slightly. So by all means, there's definitely going to still be an ability to bring people in to fill vacancies, and that's obviously going to remain important for us meeting other kind of government targets, in particular around sort of house building and infrastructure projects, which are so essential. But kind of just drawing an example together of, I've mentioned that A, the costs are going up, but B, that you might as an employer have to sponsor for a lot longer before employees become independently able to work in the UK without sponsorship. So all I've done is put on the screen. So at the moment, if you were going to sponsor a worker for 5 years to get them to the point of being permanent residents, you're looking at an all-in cost of around £12,000, of which the employer is liable for a minimum of sort of £5,500 of that cost. But going forward, if the Home Office are going to increase it to 10 years, then based on current fees, it's going to come in at almost £28,000 to get someone through to permanent residency, of which employers are going to be liable for over £14,000 of cost. So you can see there's then a lot of modelling you might want to do, and you might think, well, actually, can we use AI to fill these roles? Can we use any sort of other technological innovations to use alternative workforces, or to not need as many workers in general to fill these roles within the organisation? So that's really something to bear in mind. But as I say, at the moment, it hasn't yet come into force. Which then leaves me, I think, 6 minutes whilst we're still on the clock. If anyone's got any questions, I'm really happy to take them. I don't think I can see any in the meeting chat. But But if anyone's got any questions, happy to take them.
Hello.
Oh, I think that's a
Hello.
question. If not, we can go from the ones that a couple of people sent in, if that works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or sorry, is there
Hello.
any questions for anyone here?
Hello. Can you hear me actually?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
actually, yeah, but I'm in the student visa actually. I came last year, and I'll be back into PSW next January 2026. So will it affect me as well for 2 years to 1.5 years work visa, or will it be the same like 2 years?
So if you're currently on the student visa, so if you're going to then look to move to the graduate visa, which is pretty common, the graduate visa has the benefit that you're not tied to a sponsor for that, what is at the moment 2 years. I say the government are planning to reduce that graduate visa down to 18 months rather than 2 years. I think that is due to come in with a view that it'll be whoever it's at the point of application for the graduate visa. So not necessarily when you came in as a student, but at the point at which you apply for the graduate visa. So it's obviously hard to say because I don't know how quickly those changes are going to come in. But my expectation is that just because you're already here isn't likely to exempt you from any of the rule changes. So you're not likely to be grandfathered, I'm afraid, would be my personal opinion based on the announcements that we've seen. So it might be that you say, well, look, I'm going to look for a sponsored visa more quickly then, because that'll kind of eliminate that kind of disadvantage that you're going to have by going under the new rules. So that's entirely up to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And one more questions as well. So, so let's say when I change into the skilled work visa over next year, maybe, so then ILR extensions from 5 to 10 maybe
Mhm.
will affect me as well, right? So when I apply from maybe from 2026 onwards. So
Yes, that's the expectation. So the Home Secretary's currently said that they are expecting to apply that to anybody that's already in the UK, the 10-year rule. What I would say though is obviously they have said it'll be 10 years as standard, but some people will qualify depending on their contribution that they make to the UK. And now, what they are going to mean by contribution to the UK, it's hard to say whether it's the amount of tax you paid or the sort of job that you do, because they've kind of indicated so far that there might be some concessions on the 10-year for nurses, doctors, and AI specialists, and also those that make an economic contribution. So it might be that the government say, well, look, we've got critical infrastructure projects that we really need these workers, and therefore if you work in construction, real estate, that we might give a concession to those particular where we're really struggling to fill those gaps. But I'm afraid at the moment it's not very helpful because I can't give you any further detail because it's still pending consultation, I'm afraid.
yeah, actually, yeah, thank you. And actually, yeah, this is could be the exceptional case. And currently, I'm working the Birmingham City Council actually, and and uh, uh, and I think that okay, let's say so if they are sponsoring me, then it's a government anyway. So then will it? So I'm working in the real estate industry. I'm the building surveyor now.
Hmm.
So let's say so if they are sponsoring me, maybe in the future or near future, so is there any possibility get on, with ILR within 5 years or something like that, or because of the government sponsorship, or it did?
Potentially, yeah. They
Yeah.
might say, look, if you're a public sector worker, that you would qualify in a shorter period. Absolutely, because obviously those sectors, um, you know, sometimes struggle to recruit over the private sector. So that could be something. All I would say is at the moment, it's all up for consultation. The best I can say to people is it might be worth pinging a message over to your MP to say, well, look, I think that would be a good suggestion. And obviously, when that consultation paper comes up, if you've already spoken to your MP, they might be willing to put that view forward to the government when they're making those decisions. So that might be a good thing to do in the meantime.
Well, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure. And I can see we've got a question in the chat was just around switching from an asylum claim to skilled worker. Unfortunately not. So the Home Office are very strict and limiting on those that have got pending asylum claims, because what they don't want people is to make sort of what they deem to be gratuitous asylum claims just to be able to sit in the UK and then move over. But I think there's definitely been quite a few instances of people where they then find a position and they could get skilled worker sponsorship, but at the moment it's very, very difficult to do that, and the general position is that no, you can't switch and you'll have to wait for your asylum claim to be heard and decided before you can then switch to skilled worker. So kind of the best advice in most circumstances, obviously it's difficult because I don't know all the circumstances of this particular question, but generally the rule would be that you would have to withdraw your asylum claim and then probably go back and file from your home country for the skilled worker application. So that's not going to be a straightforward process for anybody, because the Home Office will question the genuineness of the original asylum claim. So you might want to wait till you've had a decision on that before you progress. But I know, obviously, because you can't work as an asylum seeker, that can cause a lot of difficulty and hardship in the meantime. So I do empathise with that, but it's not very straightforward, no.
So I have a few questions, if that's okay,
Of
Sacha.
course, yeah.
So given the costs are going up, and like, to be honest, they seem like a bit astronomical. Given like the cost of a certificate of sponsorship and what it used to be years ago. So given obviously the Labour wants to decrease numbers to UK, like previous governments have done, but is this uh, how much is this about like increasing the amount of money you can make from businesses, and how much is it about decreasing numbers? Because surely to some extent they're just putting increasing pressure on the construction industry, which is already struggling
Yeah.
given the current circumstances.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think from their perspective, it's kind of a virtuous circle from their perspective, because ultimately it brings down the numbers and it's extra revenue into the treasury, which they don't have to specifically, I know there's been a lot of sort of contention around the fact that the immigration skills charge that employers pay doesn't necessarily at the moment go directly, for example, to the Department for Education or any of the kind of initiatives that are around upskilling. It just goes into the general treasury kind of black hole. So the government's position has always been with visas that it shouldn't cost the government money to process visas, but absolutely at the moment they're making an uplift. So yeah, I think from their perspective, in the current climate, for them it's a good outcome in both ways. So it costs a lot. It deters what they might deem potentially unnecessary applications, makes them money and helps reduce numbers. So I don't know that I can see that shifting anytime soon. We have seen some concessions over the years where sectors are particularly important. So the health and care sector, for example, have had some concession on cost. So it might be that, look, when they've made these changes, if actually the industry's saying, God, like we're really genuinely stuffed now and we can't deliver the projects that you want, that they would then retrospectively put some discounts in. But I think with the current mandate, until the migration figures have come down quite a bit more, and I think that the new proposals will take about 100,000 off the numbers from what the Home Secretary estimated. It won't be till the numbers have come down quite a bit more before they start worrying about whether or not it's really biting too hard. So yeah, we'll wait and see. It does change a lot though. I mean, twice a year as a minimum, the visa rules change, so anything's possible.
Sure, no worries. And then is the overseas representative visa still open, or has that changed?
No, so that's gone. So we have instead, so the representative in overseas business used to be where you had an established business overseas outside of the UK, and you were effectively coming into the UK to start up business and do a new branch over here. So they've replaced that with now what we call the expansion worker visa. And one of the things actually is the Home Office have actually announced with the new white paper that there'll be more concessions to encourage more of that. So they would really like overseas companies to come and invest and start up in the UK. So actually, though, that is the one visa category, or one of the very few visa categories, where we'll see some easing of visa restrictions actually in the new under the new regime.
Fair enough. And is there any way businesses can feed into policy changes?
Yeah, so at the moment we don't have any live consultations. The government have promised that there will be consultation on all of this. So I think the key things are individuals to engage with their MPs. If you're a business operating in the sector, either speaking for your local trades body, national trade representation, anyone that's kind of a stakeholder, the unions as well, they will all feed into the government conversation around this. Yeah, really engage in the industry, I would say, and kind of get your messages heard. But I think actually the government find it quite frustrating when they do launch consultations. So the Migration Advisory Committee often get commissioned. They'll put out a plea for people to provide evidence and feedback, and they very often don't receive it. And some companies are obviously very nervous about reputationally what it looks like for them, but they are often willing to take submissions on an anonymous basis. So I would say, keep an eye out. There's certainly updates via the .gov website that will come out. So if you are feeling particularly concerned as a business, usually you want to use your industry body to field the questions for you or feedback for you, but you can certainly do so directly as well very often.
Fab. And then I think Mary Collins, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to say thank you for the very informative session. And then I wanted to quickly clarify. I am currently on a graduate visa, and I have got a business in its startup stage, and just wanted to confirm if the terms and conditions for self-sponsorship are the same thing with a skilled worker visa.
Yeah, so it's actually a bit of a misnomer. There's actually no such thing as a self-sponsorship visa, and I think that's a real common misconception. It's advertised a lot by certain organisations calling it self-sponsorship, but what that means is if you have a business of which you're a majority or a whole, you own the whole of the shareholding of that company,
Yeah.
the company in theory could provide you with visa sponsorship. But it's not possible to do that unless you have other employees in the business that can overtake the role of immigration compliance. And what I would say is I've seen a very vast increase in the number of Home Office refusals, because the intention is not that people start up companies to then pursue their own visa sponsorship. So there's a lot of review of what they call genuineness of those setups. And certainly lots of businesses are genuinely people are just making a start of them and getting them off the ground, but there's a lot of scrutiny over them. So it's not to say it's impossible. So if you are a shareholder of a business that would be looking to sponsor you, whether it was a minority or a majority stake, then it's potentially at the moment under the current rules plausible, but it does face a lot of scrutiny. So you would probably need quite a bit of help getting that application over the line, is what I would say.
Thank you.
Great. I think there's just been a question in the chat. I mean, I'm happy to stay and answer the questions. Obviously, I appreciate some people will need to go. But around how do you go about securing visa sponsorship if you're on a graduate visa at the moment? I mean, it can be really difficult, undoubtedly. Now, what I would say is there is a public register of all companies that have a sponsor license. So if you're looking at a vacancy before you apply, you can check on the public register if that company already has a sponsorship license. So that's probably a good vetting exercise to take first, because if the company doesn't have a license, it's not that they can't sponsor you, but they're going to have to go through all the application process for that first. And they may not be able to do that quick enough to fill the vacancy in the time space that they need. So that would be my recommendation, is just really checking before you apply for a role whether or not they've already got a license, and that'll just maybe help you be more targeting about who you're applying with. So do have a look at the public register. And I think, yeah, that probably answers both the questions in the chat at the moment. So there's a big list. I mean, I think there's 130,000 approved sponsors on that list. So it's a lot of companies to run through. So I can't say with any recommendation who to go to, because obviously it depends on what the role is. But yeah, check the list, and at least that'll kind of screen out anyone that wouldn't be able to sponsor you straight off.
No worries. I think we're done with all the questions.
Great.
Thank you so much, Sacha. That was fantastic. I really
It was a
appreciate
pleasure.
you attending today, and we'll send the slides and follow up hopefully this week for anyone that wants a recap or has asked for a recording, and others obviously within our network. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for attending, and hope to see you guys soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks ever so much. Bye.